In May 1992, Giovanni Falcone, one of Italy's most prominent anti-mafia judges at the time, was traveling along a highway in Sicily when a powerful bomb exploded, ripping the car to shreds. The blast killed Falcone, his wife, and 3 officers from their police escort. The Cosa Nostra wanted to end the work of Falcone and his colleagues, but it had the reverse effect. The assassination galvanized the whole country. It gave birth to a new generation of jurists, law enforcement officials, activists, journalists, scholars, and ordinary citizens determined to fight against the mafia. In the last episode, we talked about how entrenched the criminal actors are in Italy's society. But Italy today is very different from what it was almost exactly 30 years ago. The days of visceral violence, like the brutal killing of Falcone, are gone. It has a strong legislative framework against organized crime, multiple agencies to deal with this phenomenon, and a strong and thriving civil society. In fact, Italy is only one of 9 countries in the world where both criminality and resilience scores are high. How did this happen? What's being done to deprive the mafia of their revenues? And what can other countries learn from Italy's experience? This is what we're going to talk about in this episode of The Index from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. I'm Danlai Nguyen. In this series, we'll take a deep dive onto the Global Organized Crime Index and take a look at some of the biggest organized crime threats facing countries and regions around the world. For this second episode on Italy, we've brought back the same experts: Enna Sergi, Professor of Criminology and Organized Crime at the University of Essex, and an expert on 'Ndrangheta, Luca Storti, Associate Professor of Economic Sociology at the University of Turin, as well as a visiting research fellow at King's College in London, and Monica Uzai, International Program Coordinator at Libera, a network of associations that is fighting organized crime and corruption. I started by asking them to explain this paradox of Italy's high criminality and resilience scores.
There is an old saying that basically we always use in Italy and when we talk with others outside of Italy, which is that you only see, obviously, what you want to see. So the more you see a phenomenon, obviously, the more you learn about it, the higher you tend to invest, the most you tend to invest in its countering. So it is not surprising to me to see that both scores are high, because obviously the knowledge that we have on mafias and organized crime more generally has led to the combating of it. So if you don't see a phenomenon, you might fool yourself that you are scoring low, but obviously that also means you are not really reacting appropriately. So I think the two things go hand in hand. The more you know something, the more you can react to something. And then obviously there have been historical reasons, which I'm sure Monica can talk about more specifically, that led to the birth of national resistance phenomena like Libera, and trying to get the most out of civil resistance in times when Italy history was particularly shaped by mafia-related events in the 90s. So I think the two things go hand in hand.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, Monica, could I just turn to you now because, Anna mentioned your organization as well. And of course, one of the very important aspect of resilience, to organized crime is with the civil society, and Libera is a leading member of it. Could I ask the same question to you again in terms of whether you're, surprised that Italy's resilience scores are high, and also just briefly tell us about the history of Libera?
I agree with Anna, and we are not surprised related to the increasing of the phenomenon on the end and our strength on the other. So it's something that, as she was saying now, it's really connected with the history of our country and the history of our association and the network of our association. That is our strength in particular. Libera, born in 1995 formally, and after a big movement against the violence, the criminal violence, in specific in Sicily and Campania regions, where Camorra and Cosa Nostra were particularly violent in that years, but it's something really connected with the past too. So with some in particular politicians, as for instance Pio La Torre, that just a few days ago was his anniversary for its murder, and the role of some politicians, but in general syndicalists too, in our history. It's something that we remember day by day with our actions, with our memory actions in particular. That the strength of Libera related to our network is relying on this kind of action. In 1995, we born with a lot of organizations, churches, schools, associations, and it's something that today we are pretty singular in the world for this kind of shape that we gave to this kind of movement. And it's something that is our strength, because we are able now to resist to this kind of criminal action. And history, it's a brief history, because 30 years for an organization, it's not so much, but we know that we get a lot of results today to say that we are part of this kind of resistance.
Thanks so much, Monica. I do want to come back to you on some of the things that Libera has been doing, but I just want to bring in Luca, some of your thoughts. You've been looking at this issue for quite a while as well, and your thoughts on the resilience score.
Well, yeah, I mean, Anna and Monica have already said that there is a sort of intriguing nexus between action and reaction, which is now between mafia presence and resilience on the other side. So let me just add a very general, theoretical, let me say, remark. It's kind of contradiction, but understandable, nevertheless, I would say. I think that mafia has often been conceived of as a heritage of pre-modernity, really often, at least in the past. Another idea related to this hypothesis was that the economic development would have cancelled mafia groups. But that's absolutely a superficial explanation of the phenomenon. We have seen indeed that mafia groups are really able to establish themselves in economic contexts that are pretty innovative and rich, such as US, etc. So modernity and socioeconomic evolution are not a unique and linear path, so to speak. And so we have a lot of contradictions within complex societies, complex economic contexts. And so it's a paradox maybe, but we can figure out context in which we might have strong mafia groups, but also institutions that somehow can react, that can produce agencies that are able to fight organized crime groups. And unfortunately, both aspects can be present in complex societies.
And I want to pick up on that talk about the institutions. You know, we talked a little bit just now about Libera, but Anna, I want to ask you to look at the official response to organized crime. And Italy seems to have created a fairly strong legislative framework against this phenomenon. Apparently, the country scores 8 when it comes to national policies and laws. Can you tell us a little bit about how that come about and whether this framework has actually been effective?
Okay, so the Italian history of policies against the mafia is a reactive one, unfortunately, or probably normally, I guess. So most of our anti-mafia legislation that the world envies today is based on emergency legislation, which was passed after extremely emotive and problematic events, obviously after murders, after violence, especially linked to Cosa Nostra at the beginning. Most of our legislation came essentially in a very, I would say, Italian fashion, with basically quickly activate those mechanisms that the law allows to pass whatever legislation is needed, and then eventually recognize it as legitimate and as fully operational only later. So a lot of this emergency legislation, which for us started obviously since the early 80s onward, is based on 2 main pillars, which probably have changed the way in which we can understand the anti-mafia arsenal overall. One is obviously the anti-mafia legislation, as in the Criminal Code, Article 416 bis of the Criminal Code, which was passed in 1982. And this norm is extremely peculiar, and it is about defining almost sociologically what are the ingredients of a mafia-type unlawful association. So we already had the crime of unlawful association since the fascist period in when our criminal code was born. But this mafia-type unlawful association and the participation and membership to this mafia-type unlawful association essentially defines what, according to the Italian law, mafias are. And this is a very powerful tool because it essentially creates a legislation based on mafia method of committing crime rather than fixating on the structure of the organized crime group. So we are not punishing people for belonging to a crime group. That's a different thing. We are punishing people for belonging to a group that uses the mafia method to do organized crime. It's a very, very sophisticated criminality, which, by the way, doesn't come without problems in terms of human rights and legislation of rule of law. The second pillar, instead, is the anti-mafia district prosecutors. Those are very much part of the vision of Giovanni Falcone, one of our national heroes, killed by Cosa Nostra in 1992. This year is the 30 years since his death. And this essentially was brought into a massive overhaul of our criminal procedure, which happened between 1989 and went into force in 1991, and essentially creates specialist offices of the prosecutor's office, which guides the judiciary police for investigations in Italy, but with a specific focus on the whole of Italy territory. So instead of essentially saying mafias should be fought in the south of Italy, since 1991, we have in every district where there is a court of appeal in Italy, we do have this anti-mafia prosecutor's office, the famous DDA, which has the same power all over Italy and has specialist investigations into mafia. And this was a revolution. So to create a specialist prosecution office, which can use the other formulas that obviously the system has, it's the real revolution, because it completely overhauls the paradigm. In the rest of the world, organized crime is the genus and mafia is the species. In Italy, it's the other way around. Mafia is the genus and organized crime are just other forms of complex criminality. So it completely overhauls things. And obviously with this, we come to the last, obviously, revolutions, which came in, in 2011, we had the anti-mafia code basically putting together different regulations from the anti-mafia legislations which were scattered around. We put them all together, and they have to do with the 4 types of confiscation that we have. We have extremely invasive forms of confiscations in Italy. So it's still based basically on the vision of Giovanni Falcone. Everything, most of our anti-mafia legislation still today is based on the vision of Giovanni Falcone. So and essentially, just to summarize, it's understanding the mafia method, being able to investigate it with specialist investigative powers through the anti-mafia prosecutor's office, and third, being able to go after the money. So the 2 main pillars, the first 2, and the third one, which is kind of like brought into the anti-mafia sphere in the past, I would say, 15 years or so, is really what makes us special.
That's really interesting as well, because of quite a comprehensive framework, as well as having actually different law enforcement agencies to explicitly deal with the mafia. And like you said, different forms of confiscations as well. Luca, could I just turn to you briefly? What about in terms of shortcomings and gaps in the legislative frameworks or from the actions of the law enforcement agencies? I mean, are there any? I mean, how can they be improved?
Well, that's a very difficult question. As Anna already said, we will maybe have the chance to come back to this point. There are actually several agencies in Italy fighting against organized crime groups, and especially mainly against mafia groups. I don't think we need new agencies. I don't think we need right now new crimes in our code. We should work maybe more on the issues regarding coordination between agencies. Since the country is actually a pretty complicated country in terms of socioeconomic differences at the territorial level, and it's pretty complicated in terms of different institutions frameworks. So I think we have to try to push forward the coordination between anti-mafia agencies. This should be maybe one of the main goals that we need to pursue in order to make the fight against mafia groups even more effective than it is right now. So again, not new agencies. It's okay that the ones we have, we can innovate the way through which they cooperate with each other.
Yeah, and just to follow up on what you said about, the different agencies that Anna mentioned, do you want to just briefly add to any of the different agencies and their, roles and responsibilities?
I mean, there are a bunch of agencies, and I think a good research topic would be to map these agencies and analyze how they cooperate and they compete, thus giving rise to a sort of organizational field. But briefly speaking, Anna has already said that we have the Anti-Mafia Prosecutors Directorate, which is a national body coordinating prosecutors dealing with mafia issues, with an organization that rely upon the public prosecutors' offices at the territorial and local level. Okay, it's much more complicated, but more or less this is the way through which it works. Another really relevant agency that we can bring into the scene is the Anti-Mafia Investigation Directorate, which is a police multi-force body which is made up of Carabinieri, Polizia di Stato e Guardia di Finanza. And the Anti-Mafia Investigation Directorate works with the Anti-Mafia Prosecutors Directorate in carrying out the investigations about mafia groups. And then we have to remember another agency, or actually it's a proper institution, which is relevant to mention, which is the Italian Parliamentary Anti-Mafia Commission, which is a bicameral commission of the Italian Parliament, composed of members from the Chambers of Deputies and the Senate. And actually, the main goal of the commission is to analyze, study the phenomenon of organized crime in its different forms, and to, which is another important point, and to try at least to measure the existing anti-crime measures, if they work, if they don't work, weak and strong points, to work on the legislative and administrative anti-mafia measures, and to look at the results they produce. Theoretically, then it's a bicameral commission, so it's a really complicated institution which has had good and rich season, and other seasons have been less successful. But anyway, it's another relevant institution to mention and to bring in this complex and rich field of agencies that are involved in the fight against mafia.
Thanks for that, Luca. Anna, just very briefly turning to you, I have quite a few questions for Monica, but I just following on from what Luca said, I think this is a natural progression. We talked about lots of different law enforcement agencies and all that sort of stuff, but are there any concerns about the mafia infiltrating these agencies? Has there been examples of that?
Yes and no. I mean, there are always concerns. And more importantly, I wouldn't say infiltrating is really the concern, but rather the leaking of crucial information. So we have, for example, at the moment, just off the top of my head, and by all means not representative necessarily, in the Maxi trial, Rinascita Scott, one of the people who is facing trial is a lawyer, and his main charge is actually to have exploited his position as lawyer and have informed on investigative material that he shouldn't have shared with anyone, but apparently the charge is that he did, and he did so to support the mafia boss that he was actually defending. So that is one of the main, let's say, problems that we have, that obviously we have not necessarily mafia infiltrating, but all the people who are supporting in different positions mafia businesses and mafia affairs who might have access normally through their job and their work. So there are obviously ways in which this can be avoided. One of the many things that have been done is to essentially create a Russian doll system where essentially not only a few people can access certain type of information, but it's obviously very difficult if you are talking about lawyers and people who are involved in the trial in the first place. There have been in the past, not that I recall, in the most recent periods, some particularly nasty accusations to judges, magistrates specifically, of favoring certain mafia figures rather than others. But as I said, I would say this is normal, unfortunately, normal in the sense of expected in certain context. But we have a very strong judiciary. And the problem of the judiciary in Italy is not necessarily, with mafia trials, is not necessarily one of infiltration, the way I see it. I think it's more one of misunderstanding of the damage that, let's say, wrongful conviction or wrongful absolution can have. So I think to me, the infiltration is really something to be wary when it comes to the professions. So as I said, the lawyers, and obviously in certain context also lawyers not just working for the families but in the families, and obviously that is one of the issues. I remember, again off the top of my head, a woman who is the daughter of a very important, unfortunately for her, mafia boss in Reggio Calabria, and she was trying really, really hard to detach herself from the family. She studied law. She wanted to become a judge, and they didn't let her because of her surname and she did become eventually a judge. She did pass the exam, but they wouldn't let her work in Reggio because of her surname, and obviously the fear that even if she was well-intentioned, she couldn't be, she could be easily manipulated. So there are ways in which things have been somewhat kept under check, and obviously no system is impenetrable.
Yeah, and I actually want to pick up on that judicial system point actually, and get a sense of whether corruption plays a role in there as well, because obviously Italy has a reputation for being somewhat corrupt. In fact, Italy scores quite low, 5 out of 10, when it comes to government transparency and accountability and the judicial system. And you just talk about just now, you briefly talked about some of the concerns and the difficulties around it. Does corruption play a role, and does that affect efforts to crack down on the mafia?
Yeah, judicial corruption is not something that has been studied that much in Italy. Unfortunately, there have been. It's difficult to access data, of course, on this topic. So that's we do know about it only when we have media reports on that. So it's very difficult to to see how systemic it is and to understand how problematic it is. There are, however, some notable cases. I mean, also in. There is one trial now that I'm following in Reggio Calabria, and I wouldn't say fortunately or unfortunately, but there was a judge who is now who died. So I don't know whether we won't know much about him anymore. But he was a very prominent judge in the Court of Cassation working in Calabria, and he's been before he died, he was accused of external mafia association, and the charges against him and the evidence against him were extremely difficult to defend. So apparently that started as corruption. So that was an interesting thing, because obviously it started with an approach to, to do something against his office. So with bribery, but eventually turned out into something more systemic, which eventually led to the charge of external mafia association. So these cases, I think, more than in Italy, both prosecutors and magistrates. So I think the real issue has been when judicial corruption comes to to the public domain, with judging magistrates, because they are the one, obviously, more than the prosecutors, that eventually decide on what's going to happen in a court of law. So corruption in this sense is a concern. But as I said, research-wise, I'm not sure there has ever been any specific topic that looks at issues at the connections between mafia trials and judicial corruption.
Really interesting. Monica, I'm going to turn to you now for a few questions. We've talked about, the official response, the law enforcement side, the judicial system. In terms of civil society, do you remember what it was like before Libera was set up? Or do you remember others talking about what the situation was like and whether the landscape has changed since then and how it has changed?
Definitely, yes, it's changed. That's important to remember that I was talking before related to a movement. So it was something in the past pretty connected with the perspective of the people was to react, but not to structure something related to this kind of reaction. So the anti-mafia movement was something related to the street, to the demonstrations of the people, and just in few villages and situations, it was really connected to some activities structured and as examples for us today. Definitely, today is something different because, as I was saying before, we started to shape a network in the first part of our action. So, in the first years till 2000, we were just a national network. Then, after also the role of Libera at international level too. So, thanks to the Hancock Convention, and in Palermo, and it's something that we remember also this year, and the need of the people to structure its action also at local level, thanks to the role of the social use of confiscated assets. Today is completely different. We are connecting our role also in the world, and we are connecting our role also with other organizations too, thanks to a different kind of planning action. So it's completely different, but it's something that we need because we know, as we said several times, that the action of the criminal groups is completely different from the past too. So it's something that we really need.
You mentioned just now the social reuse of confiscated assets. Now, that's one of the measures that you've been supporting, right, to deprive mafias of their revenues. Tell us a little bit more about how exactly this works and why is this important?
Yeah, in 1995, Libera was born and launched the first national campaign collecting signatures for a bill that could add an important piece to the Rognoni-La Torre law. And the social reuse of assets confiscated from the mafia and criminal groups in this way was the first pillar for us. So after quite a year, on the 7th of March of 1996, the law 109 appeared in the Gazzetta Ufficiale, official journal of our national authorities, and finally making civil society the protagonist of the fight against the mafia and the criminal groups in this way. So through the possibility of the reappropriation of spaces and assets and creating new ones. So Libera, since that time, does not directly manage the assets confiscated, just one in this case, that's our next and future national bureau, but promotes training and participatory planning to make them resources able to trigger local development processes and increase social cohesion too. So to achieve this important goal, Libera has created a network to multiply the opportunities for the interaction between also the public subjects as the promotion of the national agency in this way. It's pretty important for us. And also the first sector organizations, so social cooperatives, associations in general, social foundation. And the main beneficiaries is important to highlight is of the project activities are voluntary or cooperation organizations which manage or intend to manage confiscated assets directly. So public actors directly or indirectly involved in the process of the destination and allocations, and obviously the citizens who can activate their civic monitoring and participatory design processes. I think that's what is representing for us the social use of confiscated assets.
And has the civil society's perception of the mafia changed as well compared to when Libera was first set up and now?
Yeah, definitely. You have to think that in the past, just till a few years ago, the people in Italy were thinking that it was just a phenomenon related to the south of Italy. So, in particular, where we got the action of Cosa Nostra, Camorra, and 'Ndrangheta. So the regions from the south were really affected by this kind of phenomenon, but the north was not in the same way. And today is completely different. The people knows the role of criminal groups also in the center, in the north of Italy, and knows too that we got pretty connections and relations also at international level in this way. So it's completely different from the past, thanks also to for instance, the role of cultural assets that we have. So the cinema, the movies, the books, that all the culture that is connected also for the storytelling of this kind of phenomenon is pretty important today to have a different kind of perception.
That's really interesting. Speaking of perception, Luca, one of the things that Anna mentioned earlier, in the conversation was about Giovanni Falcone and his assassination. How important was it that public came out strongly against the mafia after that? And do you think that sort of raised the resilience levels in the country? And did that, help to sort of shape public perceptions around mafia in Italy?
Yes, I think so. I think we can agree and claim that Giovanni Falcone's murder was a sort of turning point. It was not the end of the mafia, of course, but it was a turning point in terms of the perception, in terms of the reaction by public opinion, in terms of several reactions by institutions, and so on. So things have changed after that. So yeah, I think so. I mean, it has really been a turning point, especially I would say in terms of the perception about the connection between mafia groups, legal economy, politicians, civil servants, and so on. It has been a turning point in terms of the perception about the fact that mafia groups are not only good in running illegal business, they are really often good in establishing connection with the upper world. This has changed after that tragic event and after those tragic years at the beginning of the 90s.
Thanks, Luca. I'm actually interested. We've talked about the failures and accountability and the resilience, but I'm also quite interested to hear if there are any recent examples of successful operations against the mafia. Would any of you be able to talk about that? Anna, Monica in particular, do you have any examples?
So I don't think that there is any specific one because the problem with anti-mafia operations is that they are boasting or, on the newspaper the moment they are carried out, the arrests and everything else, and then eventually they get lost in the very intricate and absolutely not up to standard mafia trials. So the problem is that it's very difficult to follow from the beginning to the end what is actually happening. So you might see, 300 arrests and and this and that and confiscation, but then eventually how well they hold in the court of law is a whole different story. So I think that's something to remember. We are not that good at understanding how an operation starts and an operation ends. It gets really complicated. However, I think that there are operations that more than others represent a success. And these are usually operations that come after years and years and years of attempts to tackle certain areas, certain problems, certain issues. So we had, for example, Operation Crimine in 2008, which ended in very positive ways at trial up until 2016. So it was a very long trial, of course, over 300 people. And that was the trial that defined the structure of the 'Ndrangheta. And it wasn't a revolutionary trial in the sense that we already knew pretty much everything that was already in that operation. However, the difference was that it was kept together, it was treated as a unitary phenomenon, the 'Ndrangheta, and we managed to eventually prove in a court of law what the prosecutors before those who brought Crimine in were trying to do for the past 20 years. So Operation Crimine was a watershed because of that, not because it was revolutionary. The same goes, for example, for Operation Emilia, which is currently still at the end of its turn. Is an operation with over 150, I think, defendants in the northern region of Emilia-Romagna, which again is it's one of the first successful operations in the north. In that area especially, and it's kind of, it symbolically shows, basically confirms the existence of the 'Ndrangheta there. How much they managed to confiscate, how much they managed to convict, that's a different story. Same thing for Rinascita Scot, the trial, the current Maxi trial that everyone is so buzzed about outside of Italy for the number of defendants that it has, obviously, on trial. There is nothing new about Rinascita Scot that we already didn't know. However, what is new is that, again, it tells a story. It paints a much clearer perspective and scenario over a province that was already hit by several different investigations, but never quite fully told as a unique tale. And lastly, I will finish with my favorite trial of the century, which is the trial Gotha, together with the trial 'Ndrangheta Stragista, which is currently still under, with the courts in Reggio Calabria. Those are by far my two favorite trials because they bring to fruition something like 50 years of investigations. And they are not going. 'Ndrangheta Stragista is going very well. Gotha is not going that well in terms of convictions. However, their legacy is explosive. They are basically rewriting the history of Italy, the history of Calabria, the history of the 'Ndrangheta in a way that, for the first time, shows without a doubt that the famous interconnection with the elite power, with the Masonic lodges, the deviant Masonic lodges, with politics, with everything that we keep saying mafias are about, it's right there. And so I think in that sense, narrating the story well is half the success of the most important mafia trials. And obviously, conviction-wise, we need to be very, very careful to respect the rule of law here, and obviously the same for confiscation. I don't know if that's the answer you were looking for, but yeah.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And I think it was really important of you emphasizing that just because you managed to raid an operation and arrest people doesn't necessarily translate into conviction, or that people don't really follow through the whole story, right? We only see a small aspect of it. Luca, Monica, do you have anything to add in terms of what you see as successful examples?
I would like just to add something related to our role, in particular during the trials, because, for instance, Anna was talking about one particular investigation called Emilia. Its first part ended up in the few days ago, and something that is so important for us, it's our legislation foresee also the role of the civic part during the trials. And it's something pretty particular also at international level, we know. Thanks to that, also our organization, together with other associations and schools, permitted to more than 3,000 guys from the schools to stay during the trial to assist also what was going on there. So it's a kind of support also for the affected people from criminal groups. And it's something that connects in a holistic way also the role of judges and prosecutors together with civil society into the world of the institutions and authorities. And it's something that it's pretty particular because 2 days ago, for instance, we were hosting some authorities from Holland that were asking us also what we can do to get the same thing also in our country, because they understood the need of the role of the associations and the civil society together with them to try to tackle this kind of phenomenon. So just to say that, because I agree with Anna that we got different kind of situations. One where we know that it's not enough what we are doing. We need to do something more. Is pretty connected also with the harmonization of the international system of cooperation and judiciary cooperations, for instance, because it's something where we got a kind of lack of this kind of reaction, but we got a lot of good instances to catch up, I guess.
I just have two quick follow-up questions, Monica, and then we have a last question. First follow-up question, what are some of the biggest challenges that affect your work and what you do?
I guess there is the consent, the consent of the people. So it's something not feasible. We are a great organization, quite big at national level, but it's not enough. It's not enough because we know that what we were saying the last time related to the criminal system, in particular to the perception of and the fascination of the criminal groups for the people, it's something that represent for us a problem also because we get a lot of people that are not understanding that it's a challenge for us to try to tackle this kind of phenomenon, and it's urgent for us to don't have the same consequences that we get in the past. It's something that in some regions is particular quite understood. In particular, I can think to the 21st of March of this year in Naples, where we get there with more than 200,000 people to demonstrate at regional level the no to this kind of violence. But it's a particular region, and in other regions, we know that the challenge and the efforts are quite different. So it's something that we are not tired, but it's something that we need to face day by day.
I guess it's the understanding that it's a long-term struggle, and it is a struggle for every single day, right? The work never ends. Second follow-up question, what do you think needs to be done more to improve the Italian strategy against the mafia? And where do you see, civil society organizations' role as?
Well, we know that it's pretty easy. So we need political intention from the authorities and the institutions to tackle concretely this kind of phenomenon too. It's not just something that they can demand to the civil society organizations. And we got a lot of things that we can improve into our legislations too. And on the other hand, one of the problems is pretty connected with resources, in particular economical ones, because when we talk about social reuse of confiscated assets, it's not something that you can let to these kind of civil society organizations and cooperatives. You need to support also their role at local and national level. And what we are demanding is a concrete action also from the institutions in this way. It's not just something that we can rely in our laws. It's something that we need to put in a concrete pattern in our actions.
Great. Thank you, Monica. Last question for all three of you, and I will start with Anna. What can other countries learn from how Italy has responded to organized crime? Is there anything other countries can learn?
Yes, there is something that other countries can learn, but it's probably not what I've heard from others. So I've worked a lot on policy transfer and to what extent the Italian anti-mafia system could be replicated or at the very least kind of understood, I think, abroad, obviously. And I do not advocate the mafia association laws to be moved around the world or adopted because it doesn't work. It simply doesn't. I think what we can learn, what we can basically make an effort as Italians, as experts on Italy, forward is probably to learn that there are behaviors that organized crime exhibit in each context, and those behaviors form a system, and that system, whichever way you call it, whether it's mafia or it's gang or it's cartel, it doesn't really matter, is the behavior of organizations that Italy became so acquainted with also in criminal law. So I think if there is one thing that we can teach from a criminological perspective rather than a legal one, is that there is no way of fighting organized crime without the contextual knowledge of its behaviors, and then finding a way within the rule of law to essentially contrast those behaviors and the systematization of them into an organization, which is essentially what our anti-mafia law does. The second thing that I think could be more easily adopted abroad is the confiscation legislation. The confiscation legislation in Italy is very advanced for two reasons. One, the capability to confiscate without the conviction, which is a civil law, essentially, procedure, very similar to civil RICO that they have in the United States. And that allows to essentially separate follow the money track from the criminal conviction of the people who have the money in their disposal. I think that's a peculiar thing that Italy has developed, and it has developed it not just, non-conviction based confiscation is not just in Italy, but the way Italy does it with different ways to tackle the proceeds of crime, also putting the money at the center of the investigation rather than attaching them to a specific person or a specific predicate crime, the way we call it. It's very unique. Most of the time, you do need for money laundering proceedings, for confiscation procedures in organized crime, you need to prove the connection, the nexus between a person, the money, and the crime that produced that money. Italy has found a way to separate that and to essentially put the money at the center of the investigation without the need to necessarily connect it to people and crime. I think that's probably the one thing that is a bit more technical, and I think it might be better suited. And obviously, as Monica was saying before, the social reuse of confiscated assets is something that Italy has done, and it is something that Libera is very much pushing on the European agenda. It's really something that I'm sure has had an echo. One of the things that has had an echo in France, it will have an echo in Switzerland soon, if it hasn't already. Germany has started talking about it. So I think it's something that giving back to the community what was taken away from organized crime is something that Italy has learned to do. And by the way, we are not always that great at it. There are millions of problems with the social reuse, but I think it's a step in the right direction for sure.
Oh, that's a great and very comprehensive answer. Luca, what can other countries learn from Italy?
Yeah, I mean, there is a paradox here. I think that other countries have a lot to learn from Italy, but Italy has nothing to teach at the same time. And Anna, as Anna said, I totally agree with her. Changing the criminal law system of a country according to the Italian one, thus introducing the mafia belonging crime, is not realistic and maybe not really useful. So I agree with her, and it's really relevant at the same time that other countries think of having a new legislation in terms of confiscation of assets. And I would like to add that we might work on introducing more binational task forces between Italy and other countries, and these kind of task forces might be useful in order to run investigations and so on. It might be also useful to introduce a measure for preventing the flow of mafia capital into the legal economy, and to have measure to trace funds, which is not always the case abroad. And lastly, as for the presence of business in collusion with mafia groups, with mafiosi, or actually run by mafia groups in the legal economy, we need some sort of antitrust authorities, and such authorities can establish some criteria for defining so-called white lists, which means lists of firms that meet specific requirements, specific features, and can thus receive positive incentives and be granted sort of preferential access to public contracts. That can be really useful in order to limitate the infiltration of mafia groups in the so-called legal economy.
Thanks, Luca. Last but definitely not the least, Monica, final thoughts. What can other countries learn from Italy?
The other countries are learning a lot from Italy till now. During this year, we promoted a lot of projects. In particular, we can refer to two important projects that we are developing. One is in Argentina and one is in Albania, for instance, together with us to improve also the role of prosecutors and civil society together to promote the social use of confiscated assets. It's something that we are pretty glad today to have in this way. And we have also, thanks to the role of Libera in the past, promoted also for the advocacy activities that we are promoting. We got a European directive that stresses also the role of confiscation and the social use of confiscated assets also at European level. So it's something that we are concretely implementing today, thanks to the activities that we promoted till now. It's not enough, as we were saying before. It's something that we need to improve day by day. I'm in the specific working today in the Sub-Saharan Africa, where we got a lot of inputs also from there to cooperate together also with the prosecutors in where is it possible, and together with the role of the rule of law at international level. We know that we got all the good purposes from also other organizations and civil society organizations together with us to face this kind of phenomenon too.
Thank you for listening to the 4th episode of The Index, and to Anna, Luca, and Monica for joining us today. If you want to read the country profile for Italy, it's available in the podcast notes, where you can also find a link to the Global Organized Crime Index. The Global Organized Crime Index lists 193 countries around the world. It scores their levels of criminality and resilience. It's a fascinating resource and can be accessed by anyone. Just head over to ocindex.net. That's it for this episode of The Index from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. I'm Delaire Wynn. Thanks for listening.